America is only as good as its prestige. John F. Kennedy coupled these words with his views on the U.S. space program. To Kennedy, the intent of space exploration was more than putting men in space. It was a way of corroborating America's role as a world superpower. In the context of the Cold War, a U.S. victory in the space race could translate into an enormous triumph over the Russians. Sputnik was launched on October 4th, 1957. Within a day, the entire world knew of Russia's recent breakthrough. Not many non-Soviets believed that Russia was a modern, technologically powerful country. Just under a month later, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2 to rub in their successes in the early space race. Although Sputnik was a huge technological breakthrough, its biggest impact was probably political. The Russians and many other journalists of the world linked Sputnik's miraculous success to the superiority of the communist system. Various scholars and politicians remarked that the communist system allowed for more scientific growth than capitalism. In the early 60s, the Soviets used their successes in space and engineering as a propaganda tool to sell communism to developing countries. President Eisenhower believed Sputnik was one small ball in the air, something that does not raise my apprehensions, not one iota. However, Eisenhower's assessment of Sputnik was far different than that from the average American journalist. For many, Sputnik was perceived as an indication that America's military and scientific programs were inferior. The U.S. government responded by attempting to dramatically reshape the way our education, science, and military programs were run. Eisenhower perceived almost no political ties to the space race. The Russian space program is and always has been on top of the Soviets' priorities, and that policy probably discussed and affirmed by the nation's highest policy-making body. In America, Eisenhower's advisors strongly suggested that the inception of a new federal agency to deal with non-military space activity would be vital to keep up with the Soviets. After many months of debate over the subject, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, was created. The NACA consisted of multiple divisions, including a special committee for space technology headed by Guy Stever, and the Working Group on Vehicular Program led by Werner von Braun. On July 16, 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Act was drafted. The act turned the NACA into NASA, or a new independent panel reporting directly to the President. John F. Kennedy said of the U.S. space program, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." Kennedy was motivated by the Cold War to lead the challenge of space exploration and prove the U.S.'s superiority by becoming the nation with the strongest, most prestigious space program. On April 12, 1961, after years of preparation, the Soviets sent the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. Gagarin became a worldwide celebrity and also inspired Kennedy's space program. In addition, Kennedy had just experienced a political failure during the Bay of Pigs invasion. He hoped that if the U.S. were successful in the space race, then it would distract people from the debacle in Cuba. Eisenhower saw no political reasons to explore space. However, Kennedy highly regarded the space program, believing that America was only as good as its prestige. Kennedy was also driven by fear of Russian success in space. He and his administration were concerned that if the Soviets reached the moon first, that space would be filled with weapons of mass destruction and conquest, rather than a banner of freedom and peace. During the next 5 years, NASA expected to double the number of scientists and engineers in the area, and to increase its outlays and salaries and expenses by $60 million a year and invest $200 million in plant and laboratory facilities in order to benefit the U.S. space program. Following the transformation of the U.S. space program, the U.S. began experiencing great successes with their Mercury program. On May 5, 1961, the program put the first American, Alan Shepard, in space. By 1963, NASA declared Mercury a complete success and decided to take the next step in exploring the frontier. NASA elected that instead of skipping right to the Apollo project, creating an intermediate project testing more advanced spaceflight techniques would be the best path to take. NASA then generated Project Gemini. The first 5 Gemini projects in early 1965 examined how long spacecrafts could stay up and maintain orbit. From Gemini 5 on, the U.S. began to focus more on testing rendezvous and docking capabilities. The final phase of the lunar program was Project Apollo. Apollo's goal was to carry a 2-man team into Earth's orbit, then into lunar orbit, and finally dock on the moon's surface. The Apollo project got off to a disappointing start. On January 27, 1967, Apollo 1 burst into flames during testing. All 3 astronauts on board were killed. American scientists dedicated the next year and a half to working out the kinks of the Apollo space module. It was not until October 11, 1968, that manned spaceflight got going again with the flight of Apollo 7. Apollo 7 was quite effective, achieving lunar orbit for 20 hours. Apollo 8, 9, and 10 achieved similar results. With plenty of successful testing under the belt, the U.S. was ready to go for broke with Apollo 11. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 lifted off from the Kennedy Space Center. The crew was commanded by Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. On July 20, 1969, the Eagle lunar module separated from the spacecraft and touched down, landing on the moon.